Ahead of the 2020 presidential election, experts and activists in the U.S. are looking for ways to combat disinformation campaigns. This discussion was hosted by the Wilson Center, along with the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the University of Washington. It's moderated by CNN anchor Kate Bolduan.
Good afternoon. Impressive turnout for an August day. Congratulations to all of you. I always say the Wilson Center has the brightest audiences, and you're bright enough to know that this is going to be a fabulous panel on a fabulous conversation on disinformation, the first of several we're planning. I'm Jane Harman, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted to be here on this August afternoon. It is August, which means that Congress and the President are on vacation. But today's topic is not on vacation, and won't be, at least through the 2020 election. So the Wilson Center isn't putting off the conversation. That being said, disinformation is hardly a new problem. In the midst of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union both tried to influence political and social narratives in other parts of the globe. For example, a new article published by the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program has unearthed and translated Russian documents related to Operation Denver, interesting name, a campaign in the 1980s to spread the lie that HIV was created as a result of the Pentagon's biological weapons research. So, disinformation wasn't invented in 2016 and is sadly unlikely to be buried in 2020. But today we delve into the context, and we have the right moderator and speakers to do that. Our first panel, which starts right now, is on historical patterns. Moderating is the very talented Kate Bolduan, the anchor of CNN's morning show at this hour, and formerly the co-anchor of New Day and The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. Kate and her colleagues have done critical work on the topic. Earlier this year, CNN created an interactive website that shows the danger of deepfakes, doctored but realistic videos that can show public figures saying and doing things they never did. Since 2016, the Pentagon has spent at least $68 million on technology to detect deepfakes, but the issue is unlikely to go away before 2020. We're also joined by our very own, very own Nina Jankowicz, a global fellow with the Kennan Institute, who is writing the book on Russian, how much do I get for this plug? The book on Russian disinformation, coming out next summer, called How to Lose the Information War, based on her on-the-ground experience in Ukraine. And we welcome Jessica Beyer, a lecturer and research scientist at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies, whose research has focused on international cybersecurity and non-state actors, as well as online political activism. And finally, Ginny Bedaines is the Director of Strategic Projects, Cybersecurity and Democracy, put that on a calling card, at Microsoft. Drawing on years of experience in political campaigns, she worked on Microsoft's partnership with the Iowa caucuses in 2016 to create a smartphone app for caucus organizers to report the results of the vote more quickly and accurately than before. So, in conclusion, in today's complex world, it's more important than ever to provide real facts and trustworthy information. Everyone and every place is being tested, including the Wilson Center. We're doing our best, and we really need our friends on this panel, including the Fourth Estate, the media, to do its part. So I look forward to today's panels, two panels. Kate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jane. I really think, Jane, not surprisingly, lays out the challenge, the issue, and the topic today really well. And I think before you look forward, you must look back. And that's where I think we should start with history, the patterns, the trends of what we're seeing when it comes to disinformation. Maybe it started with Operation Denver, as Jane was talking about. But Nina, I wonder, disinformation is not new. How far back do you look to where you would say the first real disinformation campaign you've been researching? Where do you put it at?
Well, I think a lot of people want to go back to the Soviet period and compare what we were seeing then with what we're seeing now, but there's an important difference. While a lot of the tactics are the same, the tools have changed. Social media allows the information that's getting put out there, and it's not all fake, we have to say. It's all usually grounded in a kernel of truth or real feelings, real discontent that is weaponized by bad actors, including Russia and other foreign actors. And the social media allows those bad actors to spread those messages much more quickly. They allow them to travel at lightning speed and also allow those messages to be targeted to the very people who will find them most appealing. And that's what makes what we're seeing today so much more difficult to counter. Now, looking at the modern era and disinformation 2.0, as you might call it, my book starts in 2007 in Estonia with the Bronze Soldier crisis, when a lot of false stories about how ethnic Russians in democratic Estonia were being treated in this new era, were spread among the population there, and led to riots and led to some real social discord that the Estonian government then had to counter. And they did that not by, trying to stamp out the voices of the press or trying to counter narratives that actually, again, were grounded in truth about how the Russian population there was feeling, but they did that by bringing those ethnic Russians back into the fold, by focusing on integration and education, which is something I'm sure we'll come back to later today.
I can promise that, that's for sure. Jessica, we all know at this point, especially everyone in this room, we all know what disinformation means generally and broadly, but can you define the term for us? Because this is what I'm most interested in. Because you say it's not always, it's not always what it seems. It's what's the difference between disinformation and propaganda?
Right. There's nothing an academic loves more than being asked to define something. So this is a great moment.
You're welcome.
So most people talk about disinformation as information that is false and with an intent to deceive attached to it. Academics talk about misinformation as bad information that's spread unwittingly. So, the difference between disinformation and propaganda, there are people who also divide that out, right? Like, you have propaganda often is an organized effort to, spread disinformation or information that actually isn't necessarily entirely untrue, or maybe it's the way that it's talked about. I mean, this is another tactic. So you focus on disorder rather than a narrative of like people protesting for their rights. So there's different ways that you can also look at different events and stress certain things over others. I think one of the things that academics are starting to point out is that we have these, this conversation about disinformation or misinformation, and we think, well, disinformation is something that the bad actors are doing, and misinformation is like my, aunt or something who's sharing a story on Facebook that isn't true but doesn't know. But there are, scholars, people like Alice Marwick, who say, we need to look at the social context that people are a part of. So people share information not just because they think it's true, but also because it resonates with them or it signals their place in a group. Shows that they're part of some overall group rather than other ones. And also, if you're looking at, say, disinformation in places that are vulnerable to violence, people are also, maybe they're sharing it's misinformation. They don't know that the thing they're sharing about someone coming to kidnap children isn't true, but that information is often grounded in existing, societal hatreds. So there is the idea that it's the people, purveyors of disinformation that are the malicious ones or isn't exactly true, right? Because even misinformation can also be dangerous as well.
What are the tactics, Jenny, how have the tactics changed? I'm really interested from your perspective. And we're talking about how the information spreads, but have the tactics changed, and how you guys take it on?
Well, talking about going from how things used to be to how they are now, some things have never changed, right? Espionage is always a thing that's existed. That's not new. What is new is weaponization of the information that you get. So it's not new that even political campaigns are hacked. That's something that has happened in previous cycles in the U.S. in recent history. But what is new is the tactics that the enemy uses when they get a hold of that information. And so one thing that we think about is anticipation. It's important to have a historical context in order to anticipate how to handle it, but it's also important not to solve yesterday's problem entirely and to be thinking about what might come next. That's why the conversation around deepfakes, even though, I don't know how much everyone knows about this concept, and it sounds like we have folks on the panel who are maybe more expert in it, but just it's the idea of synthetic media making videos look like they're saying something that individual didn't say. And while we've not actually seen a rise in that yet, it's anticipating that that's what's coming next. And so that's how we're focused on these issues right now, is thinking about what is next, how will the playbook from before be changed and made new in the next cycle.
You're all kind of hitting on something that I think is interesting when it comes to just the goal of disinformation. Is it always the same, Nina? Is it always to change hearts and minds, or to force a segment to do what you want them to do, or is it more insidious than that? Like, is the goal from Estonia to today of disinformation the same?
So I think what's actually interesting about what we're seeing from the Kremlin is that it's not to change hearts and minds. That's how I would draw the line between propaganda and disinformation. Propaganda is agitating on behalf of a certain cause, whether that's a government or some sort of political movement, et cetera. Disinformation, particularly Russian disinformation, is aiming to create as much chaos and disorder as possible. And that's a theme that goes from Estonia right through to Georgia, Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, certainly, especially in Ukraine. In fact, it's trying to inspire a sense of distrust in the democratic system so that people don't go out and invest in that budding new democracy. And certainly since 2016 in the United States, I think we're seeing a lot more distrust building in our democratic system as well, whether that's in the media, whether that's in our election infrastructure, whether that's in campaigns and political structures themselves. And so in that regard, I think the disinformation campaign that we saw in 2016 that continues today, although we can't tell if it changed a single vote, has been successful in that regard.
When it comes kind of to that point, is there a pattern? You think if there was a pattern, people would be wiser to it already. Is there a pattern to disinformation campaigns? Is the Russian disinformation distinct from the disinformation campaign put out by Iran, or what happened in Ukraine, is that different from what happened essentially in the United States? Is there a common element that you find in these things?
Yeah, I think the common element, and this is what makes it so difficult to counter, is that the fissures in our societies, whether those are economic or racial or political, especially political polarization, those are the things that all of these campaigns weaponize to their advantage. And that means that it's not as simple as just playing whack-a-troll and eliminating.
Fun, though.
Yes, well, I don't know about that. We should ask the folks from Facebook on the next panel. But it's not as simple as just deleting fake accounts. These are about societal issues that take good governance and an investment from our politicians and our civil servants and folks like you in the Fourth Estate.
That's really interesting. Who are the worst offenders, Jessica?
So I just want to add, I would totally agree that we're talking about exploitation of these deep issues that are going to be variable across countries. There has been some research that has found some patterns. So there are more internal disinformation campaigns than external ones. So where we have a nation state, for instance, acting against a country, you're more likely to see internal people seeking political power or acting for some personal gain using disinformation.
Within their own country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that can be also people, doing it to make money. So, ad money, spreading, stories. There were stories about that after 2016, but you see that happening as well. other research out of the Oxford Internet Institute, Phil Howard's team have found that democracies and non-democracies equally, you see disinformation campaigns inside both. It gets a little tricky when you start thinking about like how do you define, what's a disinformation campaign if the government controls the media, right?
Right.
But so there have been some efforts to try and look for patterns like that across countries. So, as to the question of worst offenders,
I guess it would have to be the worst offender of a foreign government trying to influence outside of its borders. I guess it would have to be, because who would be the worst offender of that?
I would say
like
Russia.
Hands down Russia still?
Nina's territory, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think also any actor that is attempting to use create the situation in which violence is likely to further their political goals, they would be the worst offenders, just generally across everywhere in the world.
What is it about Russia? What is it about Russia, Nina?
So a lot of times I get a question about why is what Russia did in 2016 any different than this type of things that the United States does all around the world. And I'm talking about overt operations. I'm not talking about what our intelligence agencies do. And the answer that I give is very much grounded in my background, having worked at the National Democratic Institute and supporting pro-democracy activists around the world. Whenever we did those programs, they were out in the open. Anybody could come. Anybody from any political party could come and sign up and learn how to run a petition campaign or learn how to run a political campaign. And what Russia did in 2016 was a much more surreptitious campaign that didn't get anyone's consent, right? We didn't know that we were being messaged to by the Russian government. And that's what I find so objectionable about that. Also, it's illegal, clearly. But this isn't something that anybody bought into. And we're seeing other nation states mimicking the Russian playbook. You mentioned Iran. We've seen some Saudi accounts. Certainly, China is doing this within its own borders, and Russia does it to its own people all the time. But it's that lack of openness that just goes against our very democratic being that I find to make Russia most objectionable in this case.
But here's where I think there's good news. We now know some of the playbook and some of the methods, and it now is really all about education, and not to move into the territory of the next panel, which is solution focused. Yeah. But being able to educate the public about what these operations look like. CISA from DHS put out a really great infographic a couple weeks ago all about the war on pineapple. And they essentially took an issue that is very divisive but not very political, which is whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza. I am anti-pineapple on pizza, personally.
This is going to get real, because I'm very pro-pineapple on pizza.
So they took this topic and they went through like 5 easy steps using this really simple, understandable infographic to show what the adversaries are doing with a topic, to your all's point, that is already divisive, right? We already have something we disagree on. How do they take this thing that we disagree on and really drive a wedge? And what are the methods that they use? And so I'm encouraged because I see, our government doing things. I know that there are civil society organizations that are doing things to educate our public around that. And the awareness is so through the roof. I'm not saying disinformation's, we fixed it, it's solved, we can all move on. But it is encouraging to see that some progress has been made.
From your perspective, it sounds like there really haven't been effective defenses against disinformation, maybe not very many examples historically, but have you seen effective defenses against disinformation? Are there any? Other than where we are in this moment?
Yeah, not to be a broken record, but I think the biggest defense is educating the people about how to discern what they're reading, understand the techniques, be able to filter it better. A lot of it is also about, we've been talking about disinformation versus misinformation. Like, how do you define different terms? If we can all sort of get on a similar page about what is happening.
That might be the hardest thing.
It is a challenge, but I know that a lot of people are working really hard at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would agree that education is really important, and I call these citizens-based solutions. So not just looking at children when we're talking about education, but voting age people, and helping them navigate the flow of information online. But something that does give me pause from what I've seen recently in Ukraine during their presidential election in the spring is that bad actors are now adapting their tactics to the kind of obstacles that some of the social media platforms have put up, but also
Like post Russia 2016?
Yeah, I'm talking about this year, 2019. So rather than being stopped by these walls that have been put up, they're burrowing under or going around in different sorts of ways.
Can you? I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
What are the is there a way, describe to us, how are they burrowing? How are
Sure.
they learning? What did they take from the Russia playbook that they have now grown, built upon?
So there was a lot of discussion about political advertisements in the 2016 election, and Facebook has now put a lot of transparency measures in place, so you can search ads that are being bought. There are rules that outside actors, foreign actors, can't purchase these ads, and it's a really helpful tool for researchers and journalists like myself to look through the ad library on Facebook. Anticipating this, Russia, according to the Ukrainian Security Service and based on some activity that I saw when I was getting fed ads and looking through all of that information in Ukrainian and Russian when I was in Ukraine during the 2019 presidential election there, Russia is trying to rent people's Facebook accounts in order to use them as ad mules, offering them about $100 a month or so, which in Ukrainian terms is a third of an average Ukrainian salary, in order to use their accounts to get around those ad restrictions. Now, the security service found this out, alerted Facebook. I don't think that's going to necessarily stop Russia. It's against Facebook's terms of service, certainly. But this is something that worries me because people who, might not have any strong political preferences and want to get some extra cash, a college student or someone in a second or third world country is going to be happy to rent out that Facebook account.
That seems, it's like a hacker for hire.
Yeah, that's a scary thing. And then there's a lot of manipulation going on in groups, which now are kind of moving up in the Facebook hierarchy in terms of what people are seeing. So folks are being told or manipulated to share more content that they're seeing in secret and closed Facebook groups, and that's harder for researchers like me to track and notify the correct people about. And there's also more trust in those groups, right? So people are in a group about a politician that they like, and somebody says, "Here, share this meme," and they don't know where it's coming from, but this is their trusted group. So things like that are really scary to me, and it's the non-monetized content where news is traveling organically, and it's, again, based on people's real feelings and worries that is then being amplified in a very authentic way. There's all these policies against inauthentic behavior on the platforms, but this is authentic, and how do we educate them to know that they're being manipulated? It's unfortunately, for folks who are pro-education like myself, more difficult than a 5-step process. It's got to be much more holistic, but I'm not totally dismayed yet.
Yeah. Just wait to the end of our discussion, then she's going to completely throw in the towel. Just kidding. Jessica, how would you say what social media has meant in terms of disinformation?
Yeah, I think we've all sort of pointed out that one of the things that has really changed is the birth of the internet and the rise of social media platforms means that we take those trusted groups that Nina is talking about and we put them into that structure, and then we sort of daisy chain them together, and it makes this really great structure for information to move, sometimes good information but also bad information. And I'm sure everybody here has had the experience of someone who you trust. You're like, this is a smart person. They know a lot about this thing. They share a story on Facebook or in another place, and you read the headline and share it, right? Because you trust that person, and that. There's research out there that shows that type of process is. That's like the perfect fertile ground for disinformation to spread. And it's also something that's very hard to tackle, right? Like, as I tell my students, we don't want people to not trust each other. Societies need trust to function well, particularly democracies. So how do we, give people the critical thinking skills to ask that question, particularly in, I've been doing research into Facebook groups, Facebook parenting groups where misinformation can spread quite easily. people who are very worried and maybe sleep deprived, right? Asking questions about their children's health that can take you down a bad path very quickly. I think also with the education thing, we see that being very successful in certain places. There was just a big profile of Finland, in their efforts. But in a lot of the world, the education systems are already very strapped, and they're trying very hard to do a lot of different things. And so to ask that you add this other thing in is also a big challenge that maybe here that's something that we can do. Although our own education system has some issues, it's going to be. As we move this out, disinformation is a problem, a global problem. It's going to be hard to ask other countries to do that as well if they want to solve this issue.
How much faster we know obviously information moves, just look at the news cycle, we can see how fast information moves and how fast our lives move now. But if you had to compare, how much faster does disinformation kind of take off today because of social media platforms versus pre-internet, pre-social media, when disinformation was still alive and well?
Yeah, what's the saying? A rumor will make it around the world before the truth can get its pants on. Like, that's just amplified by how we're connected. It's not just social media. It's just the fact that we are now, you can send an email faster, right? You could text somebody. I think the biggest social platform is actually your text messaging, right? I've heard that somewhere, like the way that people communicate. So information just travels faster between us, and there are benefits to that. But it also means that the bad stuff gets through. It's not, yeah.
Yeah. I followed a lot of your writings, and you've been very critical of social media platforms and how they handled or mishandled or slow to handle disinformation on their platforms. Do you think Facebook, Twitter, others, do you think 2016 that they should have known better?
It's a difficult question. In hindsight, of course, right? But I do think that in that political moment, I understand and sympathize with what happened, because even our own government couldn't make a call to say that a foreign government was agitating on behalf of one candidate or another. I wish that the platforms had been quicker to respond when it became clear what had happened post-election. And I think the solutions that have been put into place have been a bit slow, and things get through the cracks. That being said, we're having a much more open and productive conversation about these things now. I think the fact that the platforms are open to a regulation conversation is good. I think it's really important that Congress take the reins there, because there have been some worrying developments out of the White House. There was this news last week about an executive order about political bias. I think we need to make sure that we have a very, very well-informed conversation about how this regulation is going to work, and make sure that it's working on behalf of freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And I know there's going to be a conversation about this in the next panel, but making sure that we keep all of those elements that keep our democracy safe at heart, and it's not just about this political bias question, but is about creating a more robust and informed discussion.
Do you remember if there was a moment that you began to think that there could be disinformation at play, even if you hadn't been pinpointing it on Russia in the 2016 election?
Yeah, and this is very personal. Again, hindsight is 20/20, but I remember a lot of, and it must be said, they were men, a lot of men. I was in Ukraine at the time, working as a strategic communications advisor to the Ukrainian government as part of a Fulbright grant. So Russia and Ukraine were very much on my mind. I was posting a lot on platforms about my experiences there, and a lot of men, particularly that I went to high school with, suddenly were chiming in on all of my profiles and sharing links to RT and Sputnik about actually how we should reconsider the Russian government's actions. And I said, where is this coming from? What do you know that this is a Russian government platform? And it must be said, RT and Sputnik are by far some of the least effective means of Russian disinformation. But that's when my spidey senses started to tingle a little bit, and certainly it reflected a lot of the stuff that we had been seeing in Ukraine, where these links to Russian, essentially propaganda outlets, were being surfaced by actors who again, like local actors who had a sense of discontent for one reason or another.
That's really
we
interesting.
We had a similar thing happen. In the intro, it was mentioned that we had done some work with the Iowa caucuses, where we were creating an app for the caucuses to provide the results to their headquarters. So it wasn't actually how the votes were being cast or counted. Of course, on the Dem side, they do that with their feet anyway.
Just how they communicate that to
It was
like
how they
central-
take those results back to headquarters in order to make sure that the accurate results were received and released to the press in a timely manner. And in the weeks leading up to the caucuses, there started to be some Twitter activity saying that Microsoft was trying to win the election for Marco Rubio. And it was really weird. It was like all these, and of course I was one of the only ones paying any attention to this. You know, I was the one searching for different terms. And I was trying to understand how all of these random Twitter accounts essentially had the same talking points. They were slightly different, but they weren't entirely different. And they were all on the same talking point, which was that Microsoft was trying to win the Iowa caucuses for Marco Rubio. Someone even created a meme that said Marcosoft. And it didn't ever like really take off. It did, I think, hit Drudge at one point. And, you know, again, it never made it into the mainstream. It didn't become a big issue. But I remember just talking to all of my colleagues at the time and saying something really weird is happening here. I don't know why these random people on Twitter seem to have this idea. There's no article they're linking back to. Like, where is this coming from? And so that's when my senses started going off that something weird was happening without any context of who was originating it.
I can only imagine how many different people had some kind of "this is really weird, something is going on" kind of conversations. It's not just a public sector problem, right? It's a private sector problem as well. When did you begin to think this isn't just a public sector problem, this is a private sector problem that we need to be tackling?
It's a good question. I mean, the role that frankly, it answers the question just to say the role that I was in before the election versus the role that I'm in now. Because leading up to 2016, I worked on campaign tech for the company. And so I worked with political campaigns on how they use technology, sort of an evangelist for our tech. And that included some security features, but that was not our focus. Clearly, my title now is cybersecurity and democracy. We're focused on campaign security, election security, and disinformation defense. So the whole fact that that team got spun up following not just the 2016 elections in the US, but also a lot of what was going on in Europe and Ukraine and other places where this was clearly becoming an issue. Just as a company, we recognized that we had a role to play to help protect democratic institutions. It was important to us as a company, both from a business standpoint, there's a business case to be made there, but also just it felt like it was the right thing to do. So for us, I'd like to say that we were clued in or doing something more earlier, but it was definitely something that we focused much more on following the elections.
Jessica, do you see in 2016 that Russia broke new ground? I mean, from your research, did they break new ground, or was it just kind of I hate to say it's like a perfect storm of how it all went down?
Yeah, so in this question of, when people first saw disinformation campaigns, so I was, in 2014, was working on a project in Myanmar with one of my colleagues, Sarah Curran, and one of the things we were doing there was teaching, people in political parties and journalists and librarians and activists how to use social media, effective information strategies, and, the people there were talking about a disinformation problem. That there were these rumors about Muslims that were spreading. I was there right after there was a big riot in Mandalay over these rumors. And, at the time, all the Americans were like, wow, this is a tough problem. This really, is terrible for Myanmar, right? So I think, it's not, we talk about the Cold War, it's not a new thing. It's just that we've seen the consolidation of people into major social media platforms. This creates bigger channels for disinformation to spread. We see a nation-state actor that is, very savvy and has thought very hard about how to exploit, that landscape and exploit societal divisions. For instance, in the United States, where we have low trust in media, low trust in government. It's a lot of division. This is like the perfect ground for disinformation. So it's a long-standing problem, but I think in 2016 we start to see, but also Nina's tracking before that, just the practicing of these tactics and refining them and then sort of broadcasting them more broadly across Europe and the United States, but also other parts of the world.
You talked about, the intelligence community determined that Russia interfered in the election, but there was, did not weigh in, did not render any judgment on whether a vote was ever changed. How then do you measure, you could take the 2016 election example or another one, how do you measure whether a disinformation campaign is a successful one?
I think it's measured by whether the conversation is changed. So if you look at the different interventions in 2016 that Russia managed to pull off, we had the hack and leak operation that targeted the DNC. Right. We had all of these memes and different sorts of social media content that were being shared. And again, I'm going to make the point that the ads were actually the least successful part of that. If you look at on a lot of those posts, it was much, much higher than what they achieved through purchasing $100,000 of ads. Because of all of that stuff, the campaigns changed how they were talking about themselves. People changed how they were talking about the election, and the media certainly changed what they were covering. We were covering emails that wouldn't have otherwise been made public, and the conversation changed. And as a result, I think we have to assume that the way people thought about the election, if not some votes, were changed. I am not of the opinion that it is productive to try to make that calculation of whether the election was swung by a foreign actor or not. I think it's disturbing enough that the conversation around our democratic process clearly was altered that much, even if you just take the DNC hack and leak. But there was all this other stuff on top of it as well.
That's really interesting. What do you think? What do you guys think about that? Like, how do you not that everyone's looking for a report card on if their disinformation campaign was a successful one today, but how do you is that the way to judge if it's successful or not?
So I think nobody's really been successful in saying, like, can we count, So how do we know conclusively we can say Russia caused this many votes to go this way or that way? I think that I agree this is not a very fruitful way to think about disinformation. I think what we can say is we can see how information is moving. We can understand, ways in which certain types of platforms are being used to spread that disinformation. We can see people reacting to, the spread of, for instance, memes on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is a great platform for disinformation because it's a smaller platform, but it has, politicians and journalists and academics, all people who amplify information are all there. So it's a great place for saying, like, Microsoft's working for Marco Rubio and to try and get someone's attention, versus like Facebook, where a lot of stuff is even now still hidden. We don't know exactly what is being spread. My sense is that, can we, qualitatively or quantitatively say, what exactly happened there? Probably not, but we can say that we're in a different landscape in which, you have organized actors working to spread disinformation. Nation states have a lot of resources. We also see places like, the politically incorrect board on 4chan and 8chan or Infinity Chan that are, also putting out disinformation, maybe just for fun or maybe for political ends. And we have an infrastructure that really facilitates that. And so we're in like it's a different landscape. And also once, everyone sees Russia do it, other countries, it's a democratic set of tactics, right? They can use them as well.
Well, it goes back to the question of what is the goal? And if the goal is sowing chaos, which I think we can all agree at least was one of the goals, the fact that it's August of 2019 and we're on a panel spending this much time talking about what happened, I think it was successful, right? I mean, if that was the metric by which you were measuring, and whether they had other goals in mind and whether the election changed or not is a different topic. But I think at least that big goal of sowing chaos and confusion and changing the conversation, I think we can all pretty much agree that they succeeded on that one.
Jessica, what's more dangerous? Is a disinformation campaign from a government, like from a nation state, or one from a non-state actor? Is it always clear who's kind of running the operation?
Yeah, no, it's not always clear. So, governments, Russia's an example, will use non-state actors. What those relationships are, are not entirely clear. They could be hiring a marketing firm. They could be putting pressure on someone to do something. So that is one of the attribution issues we have in cybersecurity in general. So how do we know, when it's a nation state doing something versus a criminal within their border, then what type of responsibility, if it is just a criminal, does that government have? If they're like, we can't find them, right? Then, what does the international community do in the face of that? That issue, just a general cybersecurity issue, plagues disinformation. Nation states have enormous resources that most other actors don't have, and so if a nation state focuses its will, if we're going to personify it, onto doing something like that, they can pour a lot of resources into that, and that resources isn't just money; it can also be time, people, talent, and so I would say that in a broad scheme, that they're the most dangerous. But inside countries, when we're dealing with, say, political actors who are also using disinformation, that's also quite dangerous as well. So, the sowing chaos, undermining trust in institutions. I mean, this is one thing that, is a probable outcome of a well-executed disinformation campaign. And if you look inside other countries, you see a particular political faction spreading, disinformation, that can cause people to die, right? Which we haven't exactly seen in the United States. So, but nation states, I always think they just have a lot of resources. So.
What do you guys think?
I think Jessica brings up a really good point about local and political actors, and I think that's one of the reasons addressing the disinformation problem in the United States has been so difficult, because we've seen many domestic actors using the same tactics that Russia is using. And I think this is where the social media platforms get into a bit of a quagmire, right? Because we in the United States care very much about our freedom of speech, and while in Europe they're very happy to write a rule that or some sort of law that takes away those rights from people, and people are mostly happy to give them up to some degree. In the United States, this is a hard-won right that we're not going to give up. And the answer that I always have for this is, in the United States, the platforms are not public institutions. They are not public squares. They have terms of service that you sign up to. I don't think most people, when they sign up to share pictures of their kids and their dogs, are thinking about that. And we need a better model of informed consent for people to understand what they're signing up for, so that they know that they're not allowed to spread hate speech, and that's defined pretty clearly. How we get that out there is something that's up for debate, and I'm sure is going to be discussed later. But whether that is a government body who works with the platforms to decide those things, whether the platforms get together like they have when they've dealt with terrorist content to set those standards and rules. But I think that's a real area for improvement, because the same rules that make Russian or Iranian or Saudi disinformation something that we don't want on those platforms also apply to Americans. And that's something that we need to get more comfortable with and set guardrails around.
Why can't you just make an app for that?
I don't know.
Well, can I jump in there? I actually,
yeah,
so
sure.
I think the platforms have been investing a lot in algorithmic detection, so using computers to detect violations of terms of service. And I think we've seen a lot of disturbing content slip through the cracks, including recently the Christchurch shooter. Getting that content offline was a lot more difficult than I think people anticipated. And in foreign contexts especially, there were instances in Ukraine where I saw content that was definitely supposed to not be allowed by various platforms' terms of service that kept popping up over and over. It was the same exact picture, the same exact text by somebody who had been repeatedly posting that content, and it wasn't removed. And in that case, I think this is a case of we need investment in people. We need humans looking at that content, and yes, that is more expensive for the platforms, but these are billion-dollar companies. And we need people with cultural, linguistic context. You were talking about Myanmar. I mean, that's one instance where we needed people who understood that local context. And again, I think this comes back to a human-based solution to these problems, because these are people problems. The tech amplifies them, but they're people problems at their core.
What's the biggest challenge to protect against hacking still when you see, obviously that was one element of the attack coming from Russia. What are the challenges that you guys are up against all the time?
A lot of people still don't think that they're a target. They just don't. They, in part because they don't understand the methods by which the attackers will try and get to them. So there's this
like the difference between like a phishing email or something like that?
right, or like the idea of password sprays. Like essentially all someone needs is your domain, and can fire up.
Talk to me like I don't know what you're talking about, because I don't.
Essentially, if someone just knows the CNN.com, right, and that your email address essentially is that, they have ways by which they can send a bunch of phishing emails to anyone essentially at that domain. They wouldn't necessarily need to have a sophisticated phishing attack against you personally. Now those exist, and that's that kind of social manipulation is pretty scary. But I guess there are a lot of people who are like a junior staff person on a congressional campaign, and they're like, no one's after me. It's security by obscurity. I'm not someone that anybody knows. I'm not someone that anyone is targeting. I have a job to do, and my job is X, Y, and Z, and it's, and so I'm just going to do my job, and I'm not going to worry about that stuff because that's more about the John Podestas of the world and not me. And that's the biggest challenge we've found is just we spend a lot of time talking to political companies, political campaigns, and entities around the world about basic cyber hygiene. And like getting them basic, like what is two-factor authentication? Is your password?
I'm sure largely they don't even have.
A lot of them don't. They think it's too hard. It's really not. You just need to sit down with them. And so we find that sometimes we spend our days sitting down with political campaigns with their phones and like walking them through two-factor, whether they're using our stuff
like post 2016.
Yeah, that happens a lot. They don't do some of the basics. And a lot of times it's because no one's teaching them or it's not being pushed out to them.
They think that they're not going to be a target? I mean, do they really think, they still think it's like not going to happen to me?
This is not blanket everyone.
Yeah.
Right, but we run into a lot of resistance with folks who just don't think that they're a target. And speaking of the Myanmar example, it kind of made me laugh because we've tried to do meetings in some countries where they treat us like Myanmar. They're like, oh, that stinks for you, America, but that's not going to happen here in this big country that it absolutely will happen in. And so we're trying to get them to not just think of themselves as a target, but like their democracy as a target. So that's the biggest challenge, both on the small level as well as the broad, is just awareness that they should be protecting themselves and doing the fundamentals. If they do the fundamentals, turn on two-factor, don't use the same password for every account that they have, use a password manager tool. If they do those things, they're going to be protected from like 92% of attacks.
If you were a betting woman, what are the chances that, is it guaranteed, a foregone conclusion in your mind that there's going to be a campaign, a congressional campaign, if it isn't a presidential campaign, that's going to face that's going to be hacked because of what you just explained?
I think it goes back to what is the playbook this time around. We've been tracking nation-state attacks against our customers who are in this political space. We have an account guard program where if they're in this space, they can opt into the program. It allows us to give them some beneficial information, but it also allows us to track a little better what's happening. So far, we've not seen a lot of attacks against political campaign customers. We've seen a lot in the think tank space, in academia. Those are the areas that we're seeing it right now.
Do you guys have a running assumption on why that is?
It's similar to what we saw in previous cycles,
okay.
Trying to get information from policy think tanks. That's what we've seen.
I think it's also important to note that for a hack to be successful, or an attempted hack to be successful, it doesn't actually need to get into the system. If we're thinking like Russia, we want to inspire distrust in the system, right? They can just rattle the door handle. They don't need to open the door all the way. And that's what I think they've done in 2016 with the attempted hacks of our election infrastructure. Now we know, as of last week or the week before, that all 50 states were targets of attempted hacks. And what does that say to an average voter who is already worried that their vote is not necessarily being counted, or thinks their vote doesn't matter? And that's what's really worrisome to me. We can put up the strongest walls, we can hermetically seal our information environment, but when those attempts happen, that's what can inspire that distrust that's really difficult to overcome.
Something that Jenny said, I think, and I think you and I both picked up on it, is the security by obscurity concept. I think that can apply to almost like a large part of the problem, go beyond even hacks. I mean, I think that might get to the core of what really gets to why these are effective campaigns or not.
Well, we don't have really good studies on how successful, maybe Microsoft does, but the academics on how successful spear phishing campaigns are, but the ones that we do have are all like, you don't have to really target that many people within an organization, like less than 20 before someone will click. So, like in academia, our IT people are just like, their one message is like, don't click it, right? They just keep emailing us, don't click it. And I also think, targeting academics and think tanks, this is another way of getting at information sources that have been seen as credible or trusted. So if you're trying to undermine trust in the system, you go after organizations that could be a trusted voice talking about what's really happening. And so it's not a surprise. Our chief information security officer is like, our university gets hit all the time by all different types of actors after all different types of things.
We've just a couple more minutes before we open it up to questions. And you mentioned, we talked about deepfakes early on. Some of my colleagues at CNN have done some really just interesting, and it's explaining what deepfakes are, these like hyper-realistic manipulation of video and audio content that is very hard to debunk and detect, especially just from the naked eye. And it's interesting and terrifying. I think you'd said that you're anticipating a problem of it. How it almost seems like it's kind of knocking on the door, the problem of deepfakes and what that could mean, let's just say in 2020, if someone really started working on it.
Well, we've already seen cheap fakes. I like that term, which is you're not actually using AI to do anything. You're just slowing down a video to change the perception of what's happening. So you can manipulate video in so many ways that don't actually require using AI or synthetic media. And we're already seeing the impact of that kind of simple application. So what happens when they take it to the next level, as you were talking about, and have these very realistic videos? And it's a question of how you, from a technology standpoint, address it. To your point about being able to pull images off because they essentially have like a DNA on them. We being tech generally has figured out in many ways how to identify a picture and very quickly grab it and pull it down. Video is a lot harder to do that, especially when video keeps getting edited. I know, like with the Christchurch I know with the Christchurch situation, in part it was because the video kept getting edited in different ways, and that made it so hard to identify it quickly and pull it down. And that's just one example of what we're going to see coming. The technology is hard. There's also not been a lot of research and funding that have gone into countering this kind of technology. Most of the research has gone into
really
creating it.
Yeah, and if it is, it's just starting. DARPA's doing something.
DARPA's doing some good work.
I think UC Berkeley has a program, and I've heard of some private companies that are really investing in that, but it's not there yet. Do you guys anything on deepfakes?
I'm worried about deepfakes, but I'm also worried about the very, very simple content that is still having a huge impact on our information.
The antithesis of that,
Yeah. Like we're still seeing these memes that look like garbage that are getting shared millions of times, and people are like, "Yes, this is clearly true. Albert Einstein definitely said this quote," and that's really scary, right? And that just goes back to the very simple heuristics in education, 5 steps of how to identify if this is true or false.
I was just thinking about how, if you study online communities, that like the quote from the famous person, that's been spreading for years. So now you take, at least to me, this is very alarming, right? So that spreads. Imagine if you have a video of them actually saying it. I feel like we don't have the tools to deal with that, and it's pretty scary.
Something to look forward to. Let's open it up. There's a lot of questions. Jane.
I'm Jane Harman again. I should have pointed out we have an all-female panel, which is why this conversation has been so spectacular.
I didn't note it.
Oh, you did? Okay. So, Kate, you got to ask all the questions, but I don't think anyone asked you specifically about the responsibility of the media. Ginny was talking about cheap fakes, which I assume one of them was this slowdown of Nancy Pelosi speaking so that she looked like she was inebriated. When you saw that, you, CNN, not just you, Kate, what was your responsibility in terms of putting that on or just not putting it on the air and describing it?
In how fast the news cycle works. I mean, there are moments when things go from I can see it on my Twitter feed while I'm on set to they get in my ear and they say, we need to go with this. And that can be a matter of seconds. So there is, that's just me saying how fast it actually can move. That comes with a lot of risk and responsibility, as you're talking about. That video specifically, there was a real conversation that happened really quickly of what is this, find the source, and then it was called out almost immediately. It was called out immediately. It was called out as we played it, only to call it out as what it was. But it speaks to the larger issue, especially in the post-2016 world, of the responsibility of media organizations, just like any campaign, of any citizen, of making sure the information, making sure we know the source of the information, and taking time. I think there's kind of a collective thought of taking a breath and being really responsible and thoughtful of what information we're putting out, how much we're amplifying one particular narrative or one particular story or one particular soundbite. There's kind of a how much priority and weight do we put on one story in our 24-hour news cycle when things are often repeated? Just that's the nature of it. That there's a real conversation about it. Do we do it perfectly? Absolutely not. No one does. But there is a real awareness, and there's been a lot of soul searching and kind of a collective post-mortem that I think is done not just at CNN, but in every media organization of how to do better going forward for 2020. For sure. However you want to do it. Anybody, whoever you're closest to, just hand her the microphone.
Hi, thank you all very much for being here on this panel. My name is Cindy Garcia, and I work here at the Kennan Institute at the Center. And I have two questions. My first is, from your research, who do you think or who do you believe are the most vulnerable populations to disinformation? Have you recognized any patterns? And the second one is, what are some actual concrete educational tools that we can use now to address these issues? Thank you.
Do you want to take the vulnerability one?
Yeah, so disinformation flourishes in low trust environments. So anywhere there's low trust in media, low trust in the government, anywhere there's no shared information sources that are credible. So any country where people believe that there is one information source that is, maybe they don't always agree with it, but they think is pretty much credible, they're going to be more resilient against disinformation. Places with any type of societal cleavages, which probably describes every place, right? But in some places, those cleavages, there's history of violence, there's histories of injustice. Anywhere like that, also, we're talking about lower trust environments. Places where people have lower literacy rates. I don't want to say, so often we talk about digital literacy or media literacy or information literacy. Humans are usually very savvy consumers of information. So, people will be, so to use the Myanmar case again, because it's one I know, prior to the transition starting in 2011, 2012, 2013, people, you didn't trust the media, but they read it, so they knew what to say if they were asked. They weren't, stupid or illiterate. They just had different strategies in that context. So different types of strategies can lead to different and more dangerous outcomes in some places. Yeah.
And on tools, I always talk about reverse image searches. Just a show of hands, how many people here know what that is? So little less than half. That's actually really good. A reverse image search is something that you can do on almost any search engine that you've got downloaded on your browser. It can show you when the first known instance of that image is from the internet. So when you're seeing images recycled, a lot of times, for instance, the Russian government will use pictures from different conflicts and wars to show really terrible scenes in Syria or Ukraine that are actually from years and years and years ago. You can right-click if you're using Chrome or whatever browser you use and search for this image, and it'll show you the earliest instance of that image. And that's a really easy way, if your spidey senses are tingling, to say, like, is this picture really what I'm seeing? Should I believe my eyes here? And there are a couple of other methods like that I think are easy for anybody who has a modicum of computer literacy.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Dia. I'm with NALPA, National American Legion Press Association. I mentioned in comment, I'm a veteran. I work with the PSYOP units with the United States Army. Disinformation is a tool that's always going to exist. Hackers are a way to collect information. And the cyberspace is full with different intelligence gathering to do this disinformation. The United States have their own disinformation. Russia have their own disinformation. We have nothing to copy from the Russians. Now, look what did happen in the Obama administration. They carry out a strong disinformation against the campaign of Trump. Now, let's be clear. What is disinformation and what is misinformation? Misinformation could be you misinform, it's a mistake. But disinformation is crystal clear that it's done in purpose. And you have black information, which means all lies, and gray information, which is a combination on some aspects is true and some aspects are a lie. My question is this. It is very sad that media like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the different networks, CBS, NBC, had captured this information to apply here to the communities against a political party and favor another political party. That is the big problem, because the information should be, by the media, crystal clear, so people are informed and educated properly. But unfortunately, it has become very popular in the 21st century to use disinformation within the media. Why is that?
I want to make sure I understand your question clearly. You're saying why the media is not using disinformation. Can you give me an example of the disinformation you're talking about?
Well, the biggest example you can see what happened with the Mueller report, what happened against the campaign of Trump. The whole media was involved. And not only that, many intelligence agencies and federal agencies of the United States government.
Against Donald Trump, is what you're saying. I'm going to disagree with you that the intelligence agencies were working against Donald Trump. I think the intelligence agencies have kind of laid out very clearly that they weren't working for any side other than gathering information in terms of disinformation. And I don't know an example of when CNN has been knowingly amplifying some disinformation to benefit any campaign. And I can promise you, I don't know if you ever watch my show or watch some of my colleagues' shows, but that's the last thing that I wake up every day to do. The last thing that I want to do. Thank you so much. Who else?
Hi, Addie Wilson, National Democratic Institute, Myanmar. You guys mentioned Myanmar a couple times, specifically the need to counter information that's been used to stoke religious and ethnic violence. But I didn't hear any mention about the current internet blackout. And I wanted to know whether or not, on the other side of disinformation, it could be used as an excuse to write laws that put a crimp on free expression, like you mentioned in Europe, or to forward full-on censorship, like what's going on in Rakhine and parts of Africa as well.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent an excellent point. Also Myanmar, I don't think any of us mentioned here, we also have one of the, as a government, one of the government actors is also part of putting out disinformation. I think this is one of the things about this, like any issue that has to do with speech or expression, it's always going to be very messy, right? So the questions that we have to ask about what type of speech should be permitted and shouldn't be, it's never going to be a comfortable resting point that we come to. The use of internet blackouts is very common around the world and is becoming increasingly common, not just around times of societal unrest, but also during like national exams. So that using an off switch like that, which effectively stifles a huge percentage of expression that is going on, is something that we are seeing all over. And then we see in other democracies where that equation around freedom of speech is slightly different than here. Different types of laws appearing, as Nina mentioned. We see them in Germany and Australia and all over. Where we see other countries with other conceptions of, what those rights should be, finding other ways in which those rights are being shaped, right? Because as we know, no right is pure. There are always going to be trade-offs that are made. But I would absolutely guess that the use of things like internet blackouts is only going to increase as a way to, both perhaps well-meaning, trying to stop the flow of information that could be, people think is leading to violence, but also as a social control mechanism as well.
And I'll just add an example from Ukraine. And if you want to learn more about this, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about this discussion and the fine line between trampling on freedom of speech and protecting it. Ukraine has been obviously dealing with this question since 2014 when the Maidan revolution began, and they've started blocking a lot of websites. They've blocked Russian social media networks. And on the one hand, they're saying, not only is disinformation spreading on these networks, but people are being recruited to fight on the separatist side, the Russia-backed separatist side of the conflict. But there are a lot of worries when you're looking at it from a democratic standpoint, and as I know someone from NDI would do, because what if the government changes and somebody then has the power of the pen to write a website off of that internet in Ukraine or Myanmar or another country? We don't want to use the tactics that the purveyors of disinformation are using in order to protect ourselves from disinformation.
Some up here.
Thank you. My name is Camilla Bogdan. I'm a visiting fellow here at Wilson Center, and I'm also a judge in Romania, which is in Eastern Europe. And I have a very, very particular question for you. How do you address this problem in terms of remedies? In Romania, we had a lot of problems, not only with the propaganda, but with the money laundering, and with the thing that these people that are carrying out this propaganda are paid by crooks. So I have thought about two possibilities. I have identified the domains and the administrators of the domains, and I'm trying to find the beneficial owner in order to cut, to prohibit the domain, and also to think about a way of bring these actions into court, or at least before the prosecutors. But in countries like Romania or in Russia or in Eastern Europe, usually we have an endemic corruption. But I'm thinking that the propaganda that they are carrying also affects your financial integrity because they are paying in dollars. So I'm thinking if you have some best practices to share with me in terms of remedies, because we've all seen the solution, and the scholarships is pretty clear on that side. But in terms of remedies, we have to find a solution. Thank you.
Solutions is a
big question.
Is a big question, but what do you have?
certainly the money laundering question is intrinsically connected to disinformation. And in Georgia, for instance, there were protests, the Republic of, not the state, protests in June about Russian influence in the country. Of course, Russia has annexed part of Georgia illegally, but what people were protesting was a creeping Russian influence through finance that then is replicated and amplified through disinformation. So somebody importing Georgian wine into Russia would then say, hey, why don't you plant these stories in the news outlet that you own? There's a lot of problems, obviously, with a situation like that, and I think the answer is more transparency. And I'm not a lawyer, but I think transparency around ownership of domains and companies and financial flows is something that we can all aspire to and do better. And the United States and the UK have a big role to play in that we've not yet stepped up to.
Anyone else? Okay. Right here.
Thank you. Matthew Wallen from the American Security Project. I'm doing a lot of research on disinformation and sort of the U.S. role in countering it. Doing a lot of soul searching on these ideas as well. I want to come to sort of a theme that's been sort of echoed throughout this panel in that Nina, you started off by saying that basically the disinformation is targeted at those who find it most appealing. And doing some research on psychology and that sort of thing where people are fundamentally in some ways receptive to disinformation, and even when told during basically scientific experiments that this disinformation that they've been exposed to is disinformation, that it's false information, they still don't change their minds. So how do we deal with this when we're coming up with some solutions, realizing that people are fundamentally in some ways resistant to facts?
So this is where I get very cheesy and talk about civics. I think the internet, to some degree, has taken away civility from debate. And as an alumnus of my high school's debate team, I feel a need to say this, but I think, the more that we can inspire not only young people, again, but all ages to have conversations face to face that where that emotion is kind of taken away, where you have to measure what you're saying and understand that person on the other side of the Twitter profile picture or Facebook is a human being, the more that we'll get back to a really robust and productive conversation that I think sometimes that's taken away when we've got a computer screen in between us. So inspiring those conversations, I think, is something that governments and politicians have a role in playing. Getting out and speaking to constituents face-to-face is important, and learning how to talk about this stuff, which is, I hope, something that I'm going to be working on in the coming months here at the Wilson Center, giving the politicians the tools to do that sort of work. And giving people the sort of tools to do that as well. That's part of media literacy. That's part of digital literacy. But remember that people are humans, and we can have these conversations, whether it's through a computer screen or in an environment like this.
But it does get to the impact, right? That even when people are told you've been fed disinformation, how do you erase that from them?
Yeah, so I that's one of those, like, how do we solve that problem, right? I think through, like Nita's talking about, like big systematic long-term efforts, which isn't a very nice, like easily packaged policy thing. But I know as someone who teaches, a lot of students every year, one of the most interesting things that can happen as an instructor is to watch the student come into my class with a bunch of preconceived notions, which we all have, right? We all believe things about the world. We believe things about how the world is ordered. And then instead of me telling them that, that this is wrong or that's wrong, instead having them do, exercises and work that allowed them to unpack their own beliefs and understand where evidence comes from, how we produce knowledge, you see students have these moments where they're often will change their minds about things that they previously believed, will just like get lit up with that sort of like secret superpower that they've gained about trying to understand the world. And I think that, so the education system itself, building work in at every level, which I think a lot of people do, trying to teach people how to take management of, how do we verify information is true or not into their own hands. But certainly, you're right. The studies say that we don't believe when we're told that something's not true, and we often will double down. And it's more about like our trusted networks and our immediate community that makes a difference. So.
Speaking of being cheesy, when I talk about why our program exists and why we do what we do, I have a tendency to say, this is a multi-pronged approach. You need government, you need civil society, you need academia, you need tech, because the reality is it's messy. There's not a single solution to that question or really any of the other ones that have been brought up. But there are little micro roles that we can all play. So we can get out from behind a screen and actually interact with someone in a different bubble than us. We can learn from our professors and other people around us. One thing that we think about is how do we make sure that when someone does a search on our platform, that they get accurate information. That is just a thing that we can do. It's a role that we can play. We can make sure that when someone's looking for where they go to vote, that the information that's up front on the Bing platform is actually the location they should go to vote, and that we've worked with the Secretaries of State's office or whoever to make sure that we're accurately putting that information out there. So there's some tactical things that can be done, and there's some sort of philosophical solutions, but the reality is it's going to be a combination of groups and individuals acting in different ways to try and get to that.
Jenny, Jessica, Nina, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
The show continues. New panel is coming up.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, new name tags. We're welcoming one male to the panel. It's okay. We can do it.
Hey, Kate. Nice to meet you.
So listening to the last conversation, which was not cheesy, I was thinking about why the Wilson Center matters. Here comes the softball. Because we have panels like that, and we welcome points of view on the panel and from the audience, and we're open-minded, and we try to put out there not one right answer, but a number of policy options that people should think about. And if we get you thinking more about things, we're doing our job. And I think it's a job that is desperately needed in this town where people seem to crouch in their corners and lob grenades. And as I have said often, from my 9 terms in the United States Congress, I learned a lot. I was honored to serve there. But then when I had the opportunity to come here, I realized that so many of the things I wanted to do in Congress were better done at the moment, right here, because what I wanted to do was think seriously about the hard problems, have people to help me with that, because we all need help, or certainly I needed help, and I still do, and then to come up with some things that would really improve, I hope, the quality of discourse and the quality of life around the world. And that is what we try to do here. It's a little ambitious, but we do pretty well, and we're very proud, just so you know, to be rated #1 in the world in regional expertise. That's just a high honor for the Wilson Center, and it is earned every single day by the very smart people who run our programs. Speaking of which, this program, in case you missed it, is part of our Science, Technology, and Innovation program, headed by Meg King, who's hiding out in the corner and is furious that I've mentioned her and outed her. But she is yet another of the very bright and I think idealistic would underrepresent what she offers. Bright, informed, and caring people who are trying to make our world better. So back to the current topic. And Now we go from the context that exists to the challenges that we face. Our second panel will focus on the evolving threat of disinformation, which, as you know, we have not eliminated, including current challenges to social media platforms. In addition to deepfakes, you all now know what a deepfake and a cheap fake is, right? Raise your hand if you don't know what a deepfake and a cheap fake is.
Come on, guys. We did this together.
They're in. They're all in. Yes, very smart audience. So, in addition to deepfakes, state and non-state actors nowadays infiltrate group chats on social media. We all know what group chats on social media are. And use fake, get this, fake online identities to seamlessly blend into a user's news feed. Got that? What that means is, for example, in Ukraine, Russians have attempted to rent the Facebook accounts of Ukrainian citizens so they can post political ads and circumvent Facebook's regulations. Joining our second panel is Katie Harbath, who is the Global Elections Director at Facebook and the former Chief Digital Strategist at the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Welcome, Katie. And we thank Facebook, by the way, for supporting this event and future events that we will hold on this topic. Also joining us is David Green, Civil Liberties Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a very capable nonprofit dedicated to digital privacy and free speech. He brings significant experience litigating First Amendment issues in state and federal courts. So now we have a few more people to sit down. Drum roll. Second panel begins. Kate, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yes, you guys are still stuck with me. Sorry. So we've discussed, and you guys were watching it as well, we've discussed, we know what's happened, we know what's happening. Why is it so hard to prevent, to stop when it is identified? And what are the challenges of tackling disinformation today, especially on social media platforms? And the challenges of regulation and how there should be regulation. Who should be regulating? Who should be in charge of making these decisions? Yeah. These are really big topics, and these are two people who are at the forefront of it. Thank you guys both for being here. Katie, first to you. I mean, Facebook faced criticism like other social media platforms after 2016 for being late to the game and slow in the response in 2016. What have you guys learned? What would you say you've learned from 2016 and since? Where does that put the challenges for your platform right now?
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for the Wilson Center for convening this and working with us on these issues. These are definitely ones we cannot tackle alone. We're a completely different company than what we were in 2016. I've been at the company now for 8.5 years, and I've not seen such a big shift in the work and the focus of our company on a topic like this since when we did the big mobile shift in 2012, and I would say this one was even bigger. Those changes include more expertise in everything from cybersecurity to threat intelligence, to also just local expertise on the ground, because the problems that countries face there are some similarities, but there's definitely unique ones for every single country in terms of what they may be facing. Sometimes it's not foreign interference, sometimes it may be domestic interference of what we're looking at. It could be across different platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. And so we want to make sure for each country's election, we are doing the right threat analysis for understanding what we may face and what the right ways for mitigating those are. Some of the things, one of the things we knew going into this, and we're definitely seeing, is that there's never going to be a finish line. There's never going to be a point in time where we're going to be like, we solved it, let's move on to the next thing. All the fake news and disinformation is gone, because we've gotten much better in terms of cracking down on fake accounts, more transparencies in terms of ads, et cetera. But as Jane mentioned, they're now moving to other areas. We're looking at pages and groups. How do we make sure, looking at what could be happening on Instagram, for instance, and what are the right mitigation strategies that we can be doing for all of those? And so as we're going into the US 2020 election, one of the things we've been looking at and really brainstorming is trying to think about what are the different ways we think people might try to exploit the platforms, what are the mitigation areas that we can do, and also how can we be prepared for those things we may not have expected. I would say the biggest challenge for us, particularly when you think about this domestically, is how do you actually define what is misinformation and what should you actually do about it? Now, at Facebook, and agree or disagree, and this is the debate that we want to have, we believe that I should be able to post on Facebook that the sun rises in the west, but I don't have a right for that viewpoint to be amplified. And we are really trying to think about, for much of misinformation, that's why we don't take it down, but we do reduce the virality of it. And we do try to provide related articles so that people can see alternative viewpoints of that. But not everyone agrees with the fact checkers we work with who are external, not paid for, they're not Facebook employees. Not everyone necessarily agrees that they're neutral. Not everybody agrees with the fact check. Oftentimes stories are going to be a mixture of truth and fact. And so how do you think about those? What are the penalties that we should provide for people? And so we are trying to learn as we go and try to be doing something and also rapidly iterating. But that is a big challenge for us because there's still a lot of disagreement overall in terms of how we should handle some of this content.
Got a million questions.
Sure.
I really do. But David, I first want to get kind of your take. You come at this whole conversation with a very healthy skepticism of, I would say, government regulation and control of any of the platforms.
That's fair to say.
Thought of that maybe a nice summary. The warnings, though, I mean, you're saying it here, but the warnings, though, are all over the place, are all out there on how American voters are going to be facing more foreign disinformation rather than less in the coming election. I mean, someone kindly mentioned the Mueller report, but I'll read one important part from the Mueller testimony when he said, "They're doing it as we sit here. Over the course of my career, I've seen a number of challenges to our democracy. The Russian government's effort to interfere in our election is almost the most serious. This deserves the attention of every American." You are one American who's paying particularly close attention to this. What do you see right now?
What do I see right now in terms of a role for government or a role for the platform?
Or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think any time, no matter what the harm we're trying to prevent is, I think we have to be really careful before we sort of embrace a role for government that either decides truth or decides who can speak and who can't speak. And this election interference is just one of the many legitimate harms that we've had to confront over the course of our democracy, where we've had to make that judgment, where we've had to say that government just has a limited role in certain aspects here. I don't think government should do nothing about election interference, but what I don't think we want government doing is to either sort of be the ultimate arbiter of truth, which I think is an impossible role to ask government to play in many situations. And I don't think we either want government, especially telling certain people that they're not able to speak. I do think, so there may be a role. I think there could be a role for government that's sort of limited by our established, First Amendment jurisprudence. I think there's certainly things that the companies can do and should do, and many of them seem to be trying to do. But I get nervous when we really try in a role of selecting speakers or selecting speech it deems to be appropriate.
Katie, as you've just said, Facebook, you guys are taking steps, filtering. I'm probably using terms that are somewhat simplified, so apologies, before government steps in. Before any regulation would really be put in place, even though you all have talked about being open to some regulation. A couple questions on what you said, which I find really interesting. How do you determine? You said there's a level of expertise that you guys are bringing to this that you haven't before. Is that human expertise? Is that technological expertise? Because there's a balance between if there is an algorithm that's deciding what's disinformation and not, or if there's a human involved there.
Correct. And I think it's a combination of the two. And I think it's also important to remember, even with machine learning and algorithms, that there's always humans at the beginning of creating those as well. So to give you a couple examples of where we're looking at that, after 2016, when you look at bad behavior that's happening on Facebook, most people are not using their real accounts. They're not going to use their real accounts to do it. They're going to create fake ones. And we have a pretty good sense of what a typical new user on Facebook looks like. I usually use my dad as an example. Last couple Junes ago, I got him on Facebook finally. And at first, he only friended my mom, my brother, my sister, and I. He didn't post a lot right away. He was just kind of figuring out how it worked. And then he started using emojis. And then that was like, I regretted getting him on Facebook.
She's banned him from, she blocked him from Facebook.
Now I got him on Instagram too. So now we added a whole other one. But that's a typical new user. Whereas somebody who's trying to create a fake account to potentially try to spread misinformation or just spread information quickly will friend a lot of people right away who don't really have much connections to one another. They'll join a lot of groups potentially, they'll like a lot of pages, and the activity that they're doing does not look like a typical new user. And so machine learning is a place there where we can use that to try to flag some of those things that might say to us, hey, this may not be who they are. And then those will typically go through human review where we might ask them, we might have enough signals to be like, we can shut that down right away. And in fact, we block most fake accounts at the moment of creation. Whether if they're bots that are trying to start them, we can tell that and block that. But for those that might be a little bit harder, then a human will review, maybe put them an ID checkpoint, ask them to send us your ID, prove that your name is who you says it is. Another area where this has really all come together as well is around our political ad transparency rules.
Nina was mentioning that, yeah.
So that's an area where we're committed to we support the Honest Ads Act. And we have built tools to try to require people who want to run political or issue ads in the United States to have to prove to us that you are who you say you are, add a disclaimer, and then put those ads into an archive. The challenges that we've had with that is, if you think about typical campaign finance law in the past, you started with the actor. You are a campaign, you're a political party, you're a super PAC, thus your ads must have this disclaimer. We have flipped that around. We have said if your ad talks about a candidate, the elections, an issue of national legislative importance that we've had to thus far define, as an actor, you must provide this disclaimer. Now that has rapidly opened up, or very much expanded, the number of actors who have had to go through this process on Facebook that would not consider themselves typical political actors. It's also caused problems with international organizations who are not based in the US, who do want to run issue-based ads here, but are not based here. And I think it's a real question and conversation we need to have about nationalism versus globalism when it comes to issue ads, and where transparency should play a role versus where you should just ban stuff outright. Because if you think about most of the ads that the Internet Research Agency ran in for the 2016 election, it was around issues such as immigration and other polarizing ones. It wasn't necessarily vote for Hillary Clinton or vote for Donald Trump. So that's an area where we think that regulation, helping us to better define what is an issue ad, what should be required and allowed, would be really great. But it's another area where we've had to invest both in the technology side of things to try to be able to identify those ads, and then humans to also review those and make sure that they're actually in scope for how we've currently defined them.
David, I'm going to read something that you wrote.
Okay.
Because it gets to what Katie's talking about. This was in 2018. The palpable public momentum for private companies to do something to more actively moderate the content that appears on their sites is worrisome. And it's worrisome even though I share the concerns about disinformation, extremism, harassment motivating it. You're concerned about companies like Facebook or Twitter moderating what's going on their platforms. Why?
Well, it's a lot of power. It's a lot of power to control speech and to control who speaks. And we get very concerned about with governments and for legal reasons and sort of for reasons of democratic structures. And although I don't have the same legal concerns that I have when a platform does it, I'm still concerned about its influence on our democratic structures. the larger platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube wield a lot of power over who can speak, who gets to spread their message, and who can't. I think they have a right to moderate their platforms, but I really want them to do so in a way that I think is consistent with human rights principles. That when they remove content, that it's a well-informed decision, that it's a transparent process, that the person who posted the content is given notice and an opportunity to appeal the decision. These are all type of structures that I want to see in place. There is so much pressure on the company. We see, I think, what the companies experience is both pressure that they're moderating too much or they're not moderating enough. But there's a ton of pressure, and whatever topic it is they're supposed to be removing content, I think, changes by the hour in terms of where the most pressure is being exerted. That there's a risk that companies, and maybe even the companies that aren't as well resourced as Facebook, the ones who can't hire thousands of people who speak the language in Myanmar to be able to help moderate content, that the easiest thing to do is to just remove content. And I don't want to see that happen. I think it'd be very troublesome, and I think we can lose a lot of the real tremendous benefits we've seen from social media if we go down that path.
How many people, you talked about teams that are working on elections, not just in the United States, obviously. I mean, aren't the most Facebook users in India?
Yeah, India is slightly more than the United States, but
what are your teams look like that for elections, and how far are they ahead? Are they working on this? Like, how does this work for Facebook now?
So we have over 40 different teams and 500 full-time employees. That doesn't include contractors and others that we have working on elections across the globe. In our ideal situation, we start about 18 months ahead of an election. We look at and we spend time of understanding the political situation on the ground, not only from our own employees, but working with partners. I know there's somebody from NDI who asked a question, IRI, Wilson Center, others, of understanding the risks and things that they may see, understanding and looking at what may have happened on our platform the last time they had an election, in order for us to then be able to, like I mentioned at the beginning, understand what unique risks they may have and what partnerships we may need to set up with fact checkers, what civil society partnerships we may need to set up on the ground, and also which of our products do we need to build, adapt, et cetera, for that particular election. And we'll pull together that team that 18 months before, and they'll work on it throughout. I live in fear of snap elections. The UK has been a keep the car running election for me for quite some time now. You know, Italy is on the brink of potentially having a snap election. Israel's on round 2 this year of those, and so we try to keep an eye on those as well that may get called earlier, to make sure that we're trying to at least monitor it and stay on top of it, and then. The teams work on this, and we have to keep iterating. Just because we did a threat assessment 18 months before does not mean those are the same threats that are happening close up to Election Day. So this is an evolving process with all the teams working together on a near daily basis of looking at these things. And then in the last 4 to 6 weeks of an election, we'll pull together an operations center where we pull everybody together in one room to better manage all of the escalations and things that we may potentially see happening on the platforms during the election to be able to take quick action.
You mentioned the ways that people, actors, whatever, are trying to exploit the platform. What are those ways?
One of the main ways we see and that we combat is around voter suppression. Could be anything from wrong information, such as giving people the wrong election day, giving them the wrong rules around how they can vote or where they can vote. You know, we take that information down. We saw in some places we'll see people spreading around information saying you can now. We saw this in 2016 too, like text to vote or you can vote online, and that's not true. And that's why we work really closely with election commissions where appropriate in countries, so that we can both ask them if we need to for clarification, but they can also flag content to us that might potentially be violating local law that we can take action on. there's also, people might be trying to impersonate the candidates, might be trying to create profiles or things of the candidates that are not true, and we need to be able to quickly work to remove those things as well. And then also a lot too of just working with the partners, the actual people who are participating in the campaign, the candidates, the parties who may be wanting to, run ads or might be wanting to go live and might be having issues or have questions that they have a place to rapidly get those answers.
Some of the disinformation is somewhat clear cut, right? Vote here, not there. Vote online, you can't. That kind of stuff, David. But it does come down. You guys touched on this a bit, but in some way there are value judgments that have to be made. What is misleading? What is inaccurate? What's misleading, and when does it hit that bar of being too misleading? What do you do about that? Like, from your perspective.
What's the solution?
Yeah,
yes,
I mean,
please, David.
Katie would like to know. Here, you see, I'm just helping. You come from this from a very important perspective. What do you do with that? How do you grapple with that when you're talking about how quickly something can be amplified, and how fast this kind of information can move? But the rights of people to.
Yeah, well, there's lots of there's lots of sort of examples we could play around with, right? I mean, there's information that starts clearly as parody, that the initial people who share it among themselves clearly understand that it's just parody. It's not meant to be taken as truth. And then it migrates to a community where, well, maybe some people think it's parody, but other people think it don't. And then at what point does it become a concern? And we certainly don't want to say that there can't be any parody on Facebook. I don't think anybody would either be happy with that as a product or as sort of a result of a democratic, something we want in a democratic society where you're not actually allowed to, make fun of something, or not allowed to
laugh.
You're not allowed to laugh. You're not even allowed to address issues by by confronting them with parody, right? I don't think we want that. And then there's things that are what commonly more be mistakes or misinformation, right? Where someone actually believes something to be true, and it spreads. And so all these things share the problem of at what point does it trigger a different response? And I just think that's I don't have the solution. I don't know that anybody does. I think recognizing that it's a nearly impossible problem is part of it. And this is really, really difficult, and the mistakes can be really, really critical. And what we get a lot from people is that the technology is going to be some magic box that's going to solve this problem. And I'm not a technologist, but I work with many of them, and I just don't think that's true, right? I mean, I think, as Katie said, there's a role for AI, but AI is not a solution. AI might be a sorting, but we're ultimately going to go down to humans reviewing things, and humans, as we all know, are fallible and are going to make mistakes here as well. The other thing to understand, as Katie says, that there are humans at the beginning of AI, and then there are humans at the end, but humans at the beginning are going to bring their own biases in. And so the idea that AI is free of bias or completely objective, I think is incorrect as well. So I don't know what the solution is, but I do think we need to acknowledge that it's just not easy. There are some situations where, yes, something is demonstrably false. Those are the easy situations. Those are the ones where it's easy for Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or one of the other sites to, if they want to take action against that, and then to justify, and it's probably going to be justifiable under their terms of service. And then I have the luxury of only having to worry about whether there's some type of due process framing on their decision. Those are really easy, but I don't think those are the majority of the situations.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so to give an interesting example of one is reports of violence at the polls. Now, that could be something that people are spreading to try to suppress and stop people from going to vote, or it could actually be true. And so that's a situation where if we see that, where we want to work with trusted partners and fact checkers on the ground in terms of trying to understand, is there actually violence, or is it potentially a voter suppression tactic, to understand what we should do. Because if we make the decision in the wrong way, that could have very bad consequences either way. But we don't want to just assume that because an election commission tells us it's not true, they may also have a case for not wanting people to think that they're not handling the election correctly. And so we want to be sure that we're being thoughtful, but being thoughtful as quickly as possible. And that's where like the real crux of many of these challenges come with much of this work.
Yeah, and the scale of the decisions, even a smaller company like Reddit, the scale of the decisions they have to make is really, really enormous. And so I don't have your definitional problem, you have your scale problem, and these are really, really hard things to try and fix.
It gets to a big question of balance, right? And I'm interested in both your perspectives on that. It's the day before an election, something is put out. Is it better to shut it down, even if you're shutting it down and it is someone, and there is some legitimate users that are involved in this, that it's not a Russian bot? Or is it better to, is it the civil liberty of someone being able to post what they want the day before an election? Like, I know I'm kind of posing a hypothetical, but not really. It's a balance that I think obviously Facebook faces, as well as anyone who has control of a platform. And I'm interested in how you guys struggle with that internally and what you think about it as well.
So I think we definitely struggle with it. However, I do think that whether it is, people are being influenced all the time. And so I don't think we can necessarily put like, oh, within 90 days do this, 60 days do this, within 45 days do this. One of the challenges we have, and we're really trying to think about how we can do this better, is even with working with fact-checking partners, it takes no time to say a lie. It takes a lot of time to prove that it's a lie. And the fact-checking part. And so how do you reduce the latency of some of those things? Do we do some reduction of distribution before and then let it go to the fact checker? But then
that's the opposite of amplifying.
Means less people would see it in newsfeed than they normally would. And what are those steps that we should take? To your point of finding that balance because I don't want to just immediately take it off the platform and then potentially put it back up if there's some truth to it, because then we're potentially censoring, and then we're also altering the democratic process as part of that.
Yeah, it's a really hard problem, and I think there are both reasons to be extra sensitive right before an election, where you might actually want to take down things because there's not enough time to correct something, but there's also the idea that people also, their voice actually might be especially powerful right before an election, and this might be time we actually want to be, especially sensitive to people's right to speak, and so. The problem both ways. If in regulating broadcast, for example, there are some laws that click into effect, in some time before an election. So it wouldn't be, an unheard of way to deal with these things. It's maybe there's something that the platforms can do with how they amplify things. I don't know. We've been very critical as an organization about sort of a lack of transparency and amplification, and maybe user controls and giving users some ability to control their amplification. Maybe that will do a little bit to make it.
Talk to me about what's the happy medium between censorship and Katie telling me what's on my news feed versus anything goes.
Well, I think, I think from a user perspective, a lot of the problems with these tools are people don't know how they work and it makes it very difficult for them to make them work the way they think they're working and how they want them to work. And, so I think very few people understand how they get information on Facebook, even though it's sort of, if you dig into it, it can be explained to.
Or many people not ever questioning it. They don't know.
Or they don't care. I mean, people use Facebook for lots of different reasons, and I think how we use Facebook in the U.S. in a democratic society is really, really different from how Facebook is used in a non-democratic society, where its role in organizing and dissidence is so much different than it's so much more of a political tool in non-democratic societies in the U.S. And we always make light of Facebook and say, it's how I that's how I find out that my high school friends have these really crazy political views, and I keep track of my friends' life cycles and things like that. But in other parts of the world, Facebook is how refugees keep in touch with their families. It's how political organizing happens. Authentic identity policies, which may seem like an inconvenience in the U.S. if you're not trans. If you are trans, it's much more than inconvenience, are like, it could be a matter of life or death in societies where if you reveal your identity, if someone knows who you're speaking, then your life might be in danger. So Facebook is just used a lot of different ways all over the world. I'm a big fan of user controls, the idea that you allow users to customize a platform, so at least they're using it the way they expect to be using it. But that's not a solution for every problem, right? Because I think, especially when we talk about disinformation, there's with bad content, and I'm putting bad in air quotes, with content people complain about, there's two problems. Sometimes people see something they didn't want to see because it upsets them or offends them or hurts them in some way. And then there's the stupid neighbor content where I know it's fake, I can see it, I can criticize it, I'm media literate, right? But I don't trust my stupid neighbor. And I'm really concerned how they're going to do with it. And user controls aren't going to help you if that's your concern.
This is basic, but I think important, because it gets to what is the responsibility of a company to stop the spread of disinformation on its platforms. Is the goal to block all this? I mean, like you said, you're never going to reach a finish line, and that stuck with me. But is the finish line for now to stop all disinformation from being amplified straight from the source? Is that at all a reasonable expectation or goal for Facebook?
I think it's really a combination of things. I think for the things that are clear cut, we're trying to stop it as quickly as we possibly can. That's like the wrong election dates, things of that nature. For the large majority of stuff that's going to be more in the gray area, where we could show you guys a bunch of examples and you all might have different viewpoints of, is that false or not, and what should we do with that? How do we think about both reducing the visibility of that to people, but also giving them more context? There's still a lot of research out there in terms of what is the best way to help provide people with additional information about something in a way that they absorb it, and not in a way that makes them dig in even more in terms of believing what they believe. Also thinking a lot about what is the role that we need to bring in terms of transparency. The role of transparency, of understanding who is actually behind a page. And to what David said, in the US, people might be like, well, yeah, show the admins' names. Like, why not? Like, we should know who they are. But in many other countries, that could really put people's lives at danger. And I would even argue here in the United States, that would make me feel very uncomfortable of junior staffers having their names out there, that they could potentially be targeted by people because they didn't necessarily ask for that. But what is the right role of transparency, that people at least have more information to try to make informed choices on this? And so those are some of the areas of the different levers, if you will. We're looking at what's the right balance between all of those as we continue to go into 2020. And I think, it's gonna evolve as we see what sort of information we are seeing out there, what we are seeing coming from. I break this up into known actors and unknown actors, right? We want to bring more transparency to what known actors are doing, and we want to bring unknown actors more into the light. And perhaps that light is going to stop them, or at least helps give people a better sense of who's trying to impact the overall political discourse.
And can I make this even harder? So anonymity is a human rights principle. It's a human rights value. There's the ability to speak anonymously is something that's protected under U.S. law and protected under most international law as well. And there are a lot of good reasons why some people's ability to participate productively in their democracy tends to increase. The ability, when they have the ability to not, especially initially, especially someone who really just wants to enter a democratic process, the ability to do that anonymously is really important. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized the importance of anonymous political speech once you sort of get when you're not talking about advertising. So we have this value of anonymity that's really important that we want to preserve. At the same time, it's running counter to a lot of these very well-intentioned efforts to actually provide the readers, the recipients of information, with tools to be able to try and figure out whether or not this is trustworthy information or not. I don't have a solution for that.
The first panel, we were talking about kind of how do you what's the best defense against a disinformation campaign, and educating the user, educating the public, educating the voter. The more people know about that the disinformation is out there, the closer we're collectively to combating it. Do you see that as still the best defense on Facebook as well?
I think, and I think that's a combination, and why, Jenny mentioned before too, like Microsoft, like all of us need this. This is not a collective problem or a single problem where it's just a problem on Facebook or just a problem on any of these platforms. If you think back to, it's going to be an effort by all of us in terms of better understanding and helping people to think about disinformation, to think about more critically about the information that they might be seeing on the internet. It's going to be the role of, one of the things, we're potentially worried about is perception hacking. So bad actors just trying to get somebody to, whether it's somebody to write a story or put a post up on social media or to be talking about saying that there's interference when there's really not. And so people think it's happening even though it's not actually.
So just creating chaos by saying there's interference.
Correct.
That's like a double backflip.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but, in 2018, we saw some of that trying to happen, but because you had experts who knew better what to look for, you had reporters who were calling those experts and knew who to talk to and knew how to kind of think about this more. You had platforms that were working together to see if this was truth, like actually happening or not. You're able to present to the American public and to the public at large a better picture of what is actually happening on the platforms versus what the actors might be saying, what they are doing. And I think it's going to be really tricky, and we're going to have to be really careful, because it's going to be really sexy to keep talking about and saying, oh my God, look, here's an example of Russia trying to hack or trying to do something in our election. And we're going to want to make sure that we're very careful that that's actually what is happening and not just them trying to make everyone think that that is what's happening.
Yeah, and I join everybody else who's been up here and saying I'm a big fan of education as a strategy for combating this. And there's a few reasons to that. And that's not necessarily because I don't think it solves the problem, but there's a few reasons why I'm all in on education. And one is that it certainly has the fewest number of conflicts among sort of human rights values, right? So you're not getting, when we're talking about education, we're not talking about how do we balance somebody's speech rights against somebody else's rights. I mean, we don't have to deal with how do we balance anonymity against that. We don't have to deal with all of those things, right? And so it's convenient in a really, really good way. In that way. The other thing I think, as the earlier panel said also, is one of our main goals here is really about restoring trust, right? Having people be able to feel like they can make good decisions. And education really helps with them, because you're giving someone tools to at least have trust in their own decision-making process. They may still make mistakes, right? And we all know that people making good decisions, two people making good decisions, well-informed decisions, can make different decisions, right? But it's so important to have trust in your decision-making process. So that's why I'm all in for education too, but I acknowledge it's an incomplete solution. It doesn't get us all of the way there. It has to be part of a multi-pronged approach, I guess. I like, though, what Facebook did with the Indian elections in terms of, I don't know how many people saw this, sort of the shadowing, the news story, where if something had been picked up by an outside fact checker as being false, it sort of got like a certain presentation to it, and someone would then click on why you had to, in order to actually see this. I don't know, you probably know how it worked better than I did, but I thought that was an interesting, again, I don't think it's going to solve the problem, but at least it was sort of having people take one more step before they.
No, well, and what is that? Does that apply? Does that apply to the American election?
So it's something that we've been, as part of the continuous testing of what is the best way for presenting to people that if something's been marked false by fact checkers, it was a bit more of a prominent overlay for people to see that and to try to get more information before they actually clicked through and saw the content.
Like a warning, like a
somewhat. I mean, yeah. Right now, so kind of the evolution of this, when we first started doing the fact checking, we did this big red like triangle with an exclamation, something that was like really red and in your face, and it was like, warning, this might be false. And then there was some research worried about the backlash effect. So what I was talking about is like people see that and it actually makes them dig their heels in further of believing it. It doesn't make them be like, oh my God, might be false. I should like look into this more. And so then we started testing with putting the related articles underneath, as well as, and it had a green fact check symbol next to it, and you could get more information. And now and this is sort of how we learn from different elections and try to see what's going to work the best or not, is just a different way of displaying that content might be false and how they can get clicked to see the fact checker's story. And so those are all things that we're looking at, of course, of bringing into the United States and continuing to work on for a bunch of different elections.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't taking content down; it was still accessible to some. And I thought there was a very low barrier to getting the content if you wanted to see it. But I thought at least there was a pause, right?
Yeah. Another thing too that we did in India, particularly for WhatsApp, because the content on WhatsApp's encrypted, is we did a marketing campaign called "Share Joy, Not Rumors." And it was a campaign that we did in print, on TV, in radio, on the Facebook platform itself, just encouraging people to be thinking about what they were sharing on WhatsApp before they actually did that. And so we combined that with product changes like limiting the number of forwards that somebody could forward content with to try to combat the spread of misinformation there as well.
You hit on something that I think all of this discussion kind of comes back to is trust. There's a historically low trust in the media right now. There's a historically low trust in institutions, in government, in everything. And there was a real hit in trust on social media platforms after 2016. And what exactly are we seeing? Can we trust what we're seeing? Can I trust my eyes? Can I trust my ears? And Chris Hughes, who was a co-founder of Facebook, no longer with Facebook, he cashed out years ago. He very publicly came out to say, and I think it was in the New York Times op-ed, I interviewed him afterward, to say that he thinks that government regulation is the way that he really wants to see this go, because he says he says that Facebook cannot trust Facebook. He was a co-founder of Facebook. He no longer can trust that Facebook can make the changes needed because of a lack of competition to get it right. His name's on the patent of the news feed, and he says that he doesn't trust it. And that gets me to this place of trust. And it's an amorphous thing. Mm-hmm. How do you get users to trust that Facebook is using their information, moderating the information, to trust your platform?
So I think that it takes very little time to lose trust. It's going to take a very long time to build back up trust.
For anyone, for the media, for anybody.
For anyone. All we can try to do is we work on it and we try to monitor every single election that's happening across the globe. We've had this last 6 months, had EU, India, Israel, Indonesia, like a large amount of the world voted in the last half. And there were things we did right, there were things we did wrong, and we'll keep improving on that. All we can do now is try to consistently deliver on these promises year over year over year. The 2020 election will obviously be a big test for us, but we can't, again, I don't believe there's a finish line, and we're going to have to keep, this is now a part of our fiber of a company in terms of what we're doing. And so our goal is just to do our best and make sure we're making this a priority to be consistent and deliver on what we say we will, talk about where we may make mistakes and where we need help, and just keep doing that over the long run so that we can try to rebuild back that trust.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because as you were asking, the question I was asking myself was, is it important that people trust Facebook?
That's literally what I was just about to
Because
ask you. It's unrealistic.
Facebook is user-generated content. All Facebook is doing is delivering content that other people write. And so is it important that you trust Facebook? Do you expect or want Facebookism as a user, or do you want to be able to trust the people who are using it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a different question. I'm not saying that, like, I want Facebook to just, like, fly free and say, oh, no one has to trust us. We don't care.
I'll go on vacation.
I think it's an interest to me. It ties into the education question about I think you need to understand what Facebook is, and I don't have an expectation. I don't know that I even really want Facebook, except maybe in the obviously this is demonstrably false and every single person knows it's false type thing. I don't know that I want Facebook in an active role of
trust me, I'll handle
doing
it,
that. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it until you asked it, so I'm still sorting this all out.
I like it
in my head. I want people to have trust in their institutions that produce content. I want them to have trust in their governments. I want them to have trust in themselves, feel like they have the ability to make decisions. I think it might be important that they have trust in Facebook, but I don't know that it's among the more important institutions that I think. It's always good to have something that's trustworthy, but I don't know that, to me, I don't know how critical it is. Again, maybe that varies tremendously based on the user and everything, and how Facebook is used in a certain situation.
So the challenges are clear. The challenges are great. I mean, you've listed off the number of elections that you guys have been working on just in this past really year. There's a lot to be scared of. There's a lot to be nervous about and to fear and to honestly just feel really kind of beaten down about when it comes to disinformation. It seems like such a huge problem. Some of the smartest minds up here and everyone collectively saying we can't do this ourselves in solving a problem, which leaves me wondering, are you hopeful? There might not be a finish line, but David, are you hopeful? Is this a solvable problem?
Well, yeah, I can answer like a lawyer, right? I guess it depends how you define solvable, right?
Oh, come on!
I don't think we're ever good. I don't think at this moment in history, nor in any other moment of history, have we ever been able to say we're going to eliminate all false information or all false harmful information. So I don't think we're ever going to get to that point. I don't think we have the tools to do that. I think it involves too many impossible questions to get there along the way. But can we reach a point where we can use these tools, where we can some stable point where we feel like we can make good decisions, not only that we ourselves can make good decisions, but we can trust that our stupid neighbors and our relatives and whatever
really don't like
other people whose decisions we don't like, that at least even if we disagree with their decision, they made it in a good faith way. Mm-hmm. I hope we can get there. So, I am hopeful, as long as I think we define our goal as, I think, being something a little bit more realistic than ridding the world of false information.
For me, it's going back to the equilibrium. I've been my first job here in DC was started in August of 2003, and Facebook didn't exist. And even then, there was a great thought of how great and how much of an equalizer the internet could potentially be in terms of helping people to come together around causes that they care about, a way for challenger candidates that would never be able to win an election otherwise to be able to get their message out to people and to be able to mobilize them. for local neighborhoods to be able to rally around something that they want to have happen in their neighborhood and be able to do that via the internet is something that I think still exists and is still happening. We just did not do enough jobs of thinking about how it was going to be weaponized and how the bad actors were going to exploit that. And so right now we are in a period of time where we are having to play catch up, to be focusing on that, to be thinking about what are the systems and processes and things, the conversations like we're having here about what are the right roles that we should play versus others. What should you be doing with this information? This is the information or the conversation we're supposed to be having as a society. And I am hopeful. I don't know when it will happen, but I am hopeful that we will get to an equilibrium where we have trust that the bad is being mitigated, but that the good is still being able to shine through. And that's why I get up every single day. That's why I keep doing this, because I truly believe that we will be able to get to that point. We are just doing a lot of catch up still right now.
I've got a million more questions. As I can go on for hours, but let's open it up because I know you guys have a lot of questions to ask. Go ahead.
I'm John Martin. I'm a research fellow here and a retired network television correspondent. And I want to ask moderator Jane, I'm sorry, a question that sort of flows from Jane's question earlier to moderator Kate. But panelists Kate and panelist David are welcome to answer. What steps should the networks be taking to prepare to detect and report disinformation?
There are systems this is really close right now. There are systems that every network's different, but I think by and large, I know at CNN, there are systems in place from our standards and practices straight up to our boss, Jeff Zucker, where there is information before it hits air. It was when you were a correspondent, but it would be when information before it hits air, there's a real conversation about what it is, what the source is. When it comes to video content or photos, images, audio content, there are, I would say, probably inadequate programs that we have to check the digital footprint, things that we were talking about, how to debunk a deep fake, but that's something that there's a lot of catch up when it comes to the direction that's going. But there are ways to the Nancy Pelosi video to figure that out, if that was, how that was modified. How images, especially how images are adjusted and changed, and all of that is checked before it gets to air. Is it foolproof? I would say when it comes to disinformation and how in the post-2016 world, I think CNN has been doing a really good job because there's a lot of information that comes in. This is actually a conversation that I always have. I think we should talk about how much information comes in that we don't actually put out, because there is a whole slew of backstops and checks and groups of teams of people that are looking at it before it actually makes air. Sometimes, at a moment's notice, in the middle of the night. But the systems are teams of people with access to talking to Facebook, talking to Twitter, talking to Homeland Security Department, talking to the FBI, to try to root it out, to get to a source if there's a real question about a certain image, a certain piece of information before we put it out. I mean, it kind of depends on exactly the situation, but there are safeguards in place. The problem is always doing it in the amount of time that the time pressure to get it on TV or on .com to do it in a timely fashion. So, yes, 100%. Yes, absolutely. I've never been more confident or proud of the work that we're doing as journalists, and this is CNN and beyond, because there's a real responsibility now. The more you come, Facebook probably, I'm sure you kind of feel a little bit the same way. The more the spotlight is on you, the more of a responsibility is to get it right all the time. And we're human and infallible and make mistakes. I am infallible. Classic Freudian Kate. But I'm really proud of the work that we're doing at a time when I know it became a kind of funny CNN tagline of apples and bananas and facts first and whatever, but I really do believe it, and I really do think we are up to the task. Do you guys want to weigh in on how amazing I am?
I'll put it on Facebook.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Thank you very much. The last exchange just pointed to the importance of an editorial process in a media operation. Should that not apply to the part of Newsweek that's news feed, which is to say Facebook has to take responsibility for content in that part of the operation? And second, if I could, listening to the discussion about elections, it seems to me if I were a patriotic citizen of India or Britain, I'd be very unhappy with the role that this private American or international company is playing. And if, I would want the Indian Electoral Commission or the equivalent in Britain or whatever it is to be setting the rules for Facebook or Twitter or the other social media in covering my election.
Yeah.
And okay, we know the Chinese have a solution to that and the Russians, but what's the solution in a democratic country?
So we worked incredibly closely with the Indian Electoral Commission during that election. It started with a code of practice that us and some of the other social networks signed. That was in conjunction with the Electoral Commission about things that we would be doing. We briefed them on our ad transparency products and what we were doing, and in fact adapted them because they're in India. In order to run any ad, they had to get it approved by the Electoral Commission and had to have a signed form from them. And so we made it so they were able to upload those forms and have those appear in the ad library. We also had the commission during our operations centers had a direct line to us. And so during particularly blackout periods, they would highlight to us ads or other things that they were seeing that they felt violated local law in that blackout. We would then take a look at those and then take the appropriate measures as need be. And we were very public about that partnership, and the Electoral Commission was as well. The other thing, too, is that it's very important on these elections, when I talked about those teams and those people, it is not just a bunch of people sitting here in the United States going and telling those countries, oh, here's what we're going to do. We have quite a few folks who are on the ground and have that local expertise. That's why working with civil society and others are very important. And the folks on my team come from those countries when they are working on those, and so that helps to build up the trust. And also for us to make sure that we have, the U.S. is actually the exception versus the rule in terms of how elections and how the electoral process really works. And so it's important to have that local expertise.
I think in terms of the other part of your question, the responsibility question, I think, I think it might depend on sort of what you're considering to be news feed. If it's sort of the main page where people just get their stuff from their friends, which you could either set to, I forget, hot topic or most recent, whatever the settings are, as opposed to what Facebook, I think, used to do, which was actually suggest news articles to you, which was more of like a clipping service type thing. I don't think there should be a legal responsibility on Facebook or anybody to edit, to have an editorial layer. We don't have a legal responsibility for other news entities to have an editorial level. Many of them choose to have an editorial level for their own practices, but I certainly don't think we should impose that as a matter. So if by responsibility you meant legal duty, I think no. If as in terms of an ethical duty, then yeah, maybe. I guess it sort of depends, I think, on specifically what they're trying to accomplish with the product and how what their expectations of the users are.
Right here.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'm retired.
Oh, there you are. Thank you.
But sharing on Facebook is not only very easy, but it's actively encouraged even when you're not logged into Facebook. I'm wondering if the amplification of misinformation could be slowed or reduced by making it a little more work to share. For example, adding a confirmation screen which asks, do you really want to share this under your name?
That's interesting. We actually do that if something's been marked as false. So if something's been marked as false, first we send a notification to anybody who may have already shared it to let them know that it has been marked as false and to give them that information. And then if somebody goes and tries to share it afterwards because they go to that friend's profile and they happen to see it, there is a warning screen that says that this has been marked as false. Are you sure you want to share it? Now, the reason we still allow them to share it is some people might be sharing it to denounce it, to say that it is false, to give additional information. So we want to make sure that they have that ability to do that, but that is currently how the product works.
Over there. And you want to bring the mic here? You go over there, and you'll be next.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Katie and David. My name is Sarah Curran. I'm from the University of Washington. And I was in Myanmar doing a lot of the work in Myanmar. I've been thinking a lot about your team that you've built up over the last, since 2016, I guess. Mm-hmm. And thinking about whether you've encountered cases in which, like the Myanmar case, where Facebook was the internet for citizens in Myanmar, or cases where there is no independent media, there is no other, but Facebook is essentially the media force. And to what extent Facebook has a good heart-to-heart and says, you know what, we need to back out of here because
you mean
we
like
are
shut
too
down
powerful.
completely?
We are too powerful. We are too much of an influence in this place. Or how can, I mean, I guess what I'm pushing a bit back on is the regulation question. Competition, democracy is built on a fourth estate that is richly, diverse and has a very vibrant media landscape. And if Facebook is 50% of penetration in a place or more, and you don't have a government regulating it, and you don't want to be regulated, and you say you're not media, like what kind of special responsibility do you have? How do you do that? How do you self-regulate yourself? Yeah. Is that even possible? And that's really the question for David, is there are vulnerable populations in the world, poorly developed institutions for regulation. How, it's there. You're not just the free fall, everything. You can't be the goodness of everything, and you can't be just good people. Yeah. It's about institutions.
So, yes, we face that in a lot of different ways, shapes, and forms. I think a couple of things. One, even in places where we may be the majority, like that's the majority of how people use the internet, what is actually on their newsfeed can potentially be diverse. And David mentioned about how in many of these places, this is the only outlet that opposition voices may potentially have in a country. Then comes the question of, okay, great, but they're not going to have the funds to run ads and to do all this stuff. And so they're going to run through the government will run through state-run media and other things, and they'll just overwhelm it. And so one of the things, for instance, that we've done with our ads transparency is while we do have an exception for news media in democratic places, if you are a place that is strictly state-owned media, but not in a way of like the BBC, but more you think about a Hungary, they are not exempt. So if they are trying to run ads directing people to news stories to their sites, they have to do that authorizations piece. They have to be transparent because we want to make it more transparent to people of what they are trying to do, who is seeing that content, et cetera. I think this is exactly the right conversation to be having, though. Is that enough? I don't know if completely just pulling out and shutting down is the right answer to that. And I think we need to keep trying and thinking about different ways to find that right balance.
Yeah, I would not want to see Facebook not present in sort of less democratic societies. I think you all know this, but it became most sort of potent to me when I, a few years ago, represented a news entity that we would say from Kazakhstan, but they had been banished, exiled from Kazakhstan, and that the reporters who remained there had to report pseudonymously under threat of death. And the government did a really good job of keeping their publication out of Kazakhstan, except Facebook. The only way they could get their news into the country was by publishing on Facebook, because apparently, had the government decided to ban Facebook, that, like, the populace wouldn't have accepted that. I mean, and so to me, Facebook plays a tremendous role in having people access to voices that are otherwise are banned from the countries. And certainly, and I don't think you were suggesting this, certainly I don't want a regulatory system where the regulator is completely not trustworthy, as it would be in a sort of repressive regime. I don't really want regulatory systems anywhere, and I certainly don't want them in regulations arising from a non-democratic body. So I do think that this is up to whether it's Facebook or whatever the private company is that finds itself in this role to recognize it's playing this important role and to take some sort of ethical responsibility to do that. We and others, including others in this room, were highly critical of Facebook for actually being a little bit too hands-off, and for this was before sort of, I think, the big transformation. We thought they responded too slow. And to me, it's not our 2016 election that was as much of a turning point as it was what happened in Myanmar. We keep on mentioning Myanmar here.
You've called the Philippines patient zero when it comes to that.
Yeah, and so it's what happened in places like that, where I think Facebook and others found themselves were just not having the human tools to make the decisions. They're being put in the position of making a decision where they're getting a ton of requests from the governments to take down content. You have and not having the ability to sort of assess trying to. So I think I like what Facebook is trying to do now. I do think sort of recognizing that you are playing that role is an important thing. I don't know if I'm agreeing with you or disagreeing with you, Sarah.
Agree with her. More questions in the back. He was, and then, yeah. I know you guys love my commentary as we're trying to get microphones to you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Monica with the State Department. I recently went to a panel on countering violence extremism, and I look at that very similar in terms of how polarizing politics has become in the U.S., and then some of the messaging on CVE. And so my question for you guys is, as that happens, we're creating echo chambers for ourselves on Facebook, on all of our different social media platforms. For a while, there was talk that Facebook was going to create an algorithm to add a little bit more diversity to people's feeds. One of the folks who was talking about de-radicalization of extremists actually said, I got stuck. I got stuck in my echo chamber. I didn't know there was anything else. I think politics is very similar right now. So encouraging dialogue, which was talked about in the first panel, educational tools. Where does Facebook see their role? What can they do to add more?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, and there's a lot that we can learn from the work that we've been doing on CVE to bring to this space. On one, there have been quite a few studies in terms of showing that your Facebook newsfeed might not be necessarily as filter bubbly or echo chambery as we may have initially thought. Because if you think about your regular life, well, David has got his neighbors who are, sharing all of this stuff, and he might be seeing, some of that on Facebook, and sometimes people they want to turn that off, and so they might be self-selecting as well. And I think it's not just happening online, but if you read some of the really great books that came out of 2016, whether like Politics of Resentment's a favorite of mine I went to the University of Madison, it's from a poli-sci professor there. You talk about how over time people are becoming assimilated in their cities and neighborhoods.
How people choose their news outlets.
How they choose their news outlets. all of that. And it's not as, and I know you're not saying this, but it's not as simple as just showing people additional information to really get them to think about this. And so I think we got to think about tackling this in a couple of different ways. How do we think about the news sources or related articles that we are showing people? In terms of civil discourse, I know the last panel you all were talking about this. You know, one thing we've sort of found, though, that's changing now is initially when we had Facebook Live, we would get anecdotal remarks from campaigns and others being like, people are just much nicer here. And I'm like, I think that's because they know it's live and they're seeing a person. So that's about as close to face as you can get about the comments that you are sharing with people than just like commenting in the news feed. What control should we give people who are running pages and stuff for these things to try to help people stay somewhat civil? That's really tricky, though, of how do you do that in a way that you don't quickly go into censorship? And that's where it's been really hard with the gray lines of what we have. And then there's just a lot too that we're doing. And we still do all of our civic education stuff, election day reminders, showing people who are going to be on their ballots, trying to make sure they've got accurate information on those types of things too. So I think we're going to have to keep trying a lot of these different ways to try to tackle the problem overall.
You see that. I mean, you see that in how we, I think post 2016, how journalists approach. Another journalist approach kind of the information put in front of us. There are certain things that we are faced with that are not, let me get the other side of this debate. When it comes to violent extremism, white supremacy, there's not another side of the debate that needs to be out there. And that's been, I would say that's post 2016, I think there is more of that recognition than we had in the past. And I think that is, I'm happy with that change. Is it perfect all the time? No. Is it silencing voices? I think there's, my show is not a platform that white supremacist ideology needs to be on, just as an example, an extreme example, unless we're calling it out. So I think that we're seeing kind of that play out in what we do on TV and online and in your papers as well.
Yeah, I think we talk about sort of education campaigns. I think one of the things that consumers should be educated about is that is getting your news from multiple sources. And I don't see Facebook as actually being a platform for getting news from multiple sources. I think you need to go outside of, consumers need to go outside of Facebook to get things. When a few years ago, people used to end panels like this saying, what are your suggestions for people out there who want to make sure they're getting good information? I would say, well, if you have the means to do so, pay for your news and also pay for the news that you think you're going to agree with, and then pay for the stuff that you think might represent the opposite side as well. So I think a lot of that is really just how what these tools are. If Facebook aspires to be the one-stop place, the only place someplace has to go to control their users complete flow of information, I don't agree with that model. I'm not accusing Katie of advocating that, but I don't want it to be that. Just one thing about filter bubbles is that one of the great things about the internet is it has allowed people who had trouble finding community to find community around the world. And I just want to make sure in our justified sort of rush to get people out of their bubbles that we don't lose this sense of community, that there's something really valuable actually about people finding people who are experiencing the same things as them and maybe agreeing on things with them especially if their views are unpopular where they're located. So I think it's just another challenge. We're trying to develop these tools to sort of break out of things. That there's actually something really valuable about actually sort of finding your bubble sometimes.
Thank you, guys. Katie, thank you so much. David, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you guys for your questions. Real quick, Meg King is going to come up to say goodbye.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. This is the first in a series of events, so stay tuned for a deeper dive in the fall and early 2020 for conversations about possible solutions. And if you'd like to learn more, look for a series of white papers detailing specific examples of disinformation problems and more history about the challenge on the Wilson Center website. And thanks to our partners for making today's discussion possible, including Facebook, the University of Washington, and the Carnegie Corporation. Thanks for coming.
That's